Um, Good evening, third year students. Today's lesson 3, or tonight's lesson 3, is focusing on the impacts of urban tourism. This whole topic will cover the following. We are going to talk about the impacts of urban tourism. We are then going to move on to the defining what sustainable tourism means. We're then going to be looking at the importance of sustaining tourism in urban areas. From there, we are going to be looking at the principles that governments can use to basically sustain tourism in an urban area. And then we are going to be looking at 3 most important aspects that are important to sustainable tourism. So, the first thing that we are going to be looking at is the aspect of positive impacts or effects that tourism has on urban areas. But before we go into the positive and the negative impacts, we have to look at what the word impact means. So if we understand it correctly, or if I point it out according to my understanding, impacts are certain effects, let's say, that a situation or an action or something has on either a certain area, an environment, social lifestyle, for example, or culture, due to the activity of that specific something or an activity. That's why today, tourism is the activity, and the area that is impacted because of this activity is the urban area. And due to the activities of tourism, we normally have positive and negative impacts onto the environment. So the first positive impacts that we are going to be looking at is the development of infrastructure. A lot of governments have benefited from buildings, hotels, bed and breakfasts, flats, due to tourists arriving in the city. And so this is a good thing because it actually develops the area, the infrastructure of the city. And also it creates jobs. The more tourists arrive in our city, creates jobs, it adds to the GDP of the country, global distribution product, and also it increases certain activities. Leisure activities increase, recreational activities increase. Thus, a lot of businesses or organizations are encouraged to develop what we call national parks, leisure parks, basically to host the tourists as they arrive. And so, due to the fact that we're receiving all these different types of individuals who we call tourists into our city, we are now also encouraged to develop more services, to upgrade our services, to build better facilities. And so because of all these costs to the government and private companies, this will put pressure on the local people. So the more development is happening in a city, the more costs are going up for the local people. So the living standards are going high, and so as the living standards go high to accommodate the tourists who are coming from Europe and America, so as the expenditure on the living costs of our local people. And that is one of the negative impacts. On to the negative impacts. So urban tourism or tourism in urban areas is good, but at the same time it has a negative impact on the city. Things like crime, prostitution, loss of culture, drinking and driving, drug abuse, and so many things happen due to the increase of arrivals in a lot of cities. And some of these cities normally accommodate what we call mass tourism. And so as many people flock from different towns coming to cities like Barcelona, going to cities like Las Vegas and Joburg and Cape Town, these are the negative impacts that a lot of people face, or a lot of cities face, due to the number of tourists arriving in the cities. It's very important that we try and minimize what we call the negative impacts. We try and minimize crime. We try and minimize the overuse of our resources by introducing what we call sustainable tourism in the cities. How do we do that? For us to understand what sustainable tourism is and the importance of tourism, we first need to understand what the word sustainability means. And so if we read here on the PowerPoint, it says, is the development which meets the needs of the present without having an impact on the needs of the present, of the future generation. So we are saying that anything that has to do with development, whether it's the economy, whether it's education, whether it's tourism, agriculture, mining, we can develop it to benefit the needs of the current population, but it should not hinder and impact negatively the needs of the future generations. The future generations should also be able to use these resources. And so if you put this together, we are saying that tourism should develop and expand, and not at the expenditure, and it should not cause negative impacts to the environment, to the cultural lifestyle of our people. We should thus look at maximizing the profits and minimizing, or maximizing the benefits and minimizing the negatives impacts. All right, so tourism should develop in a good manner and try to avoid the negative impacts. That's what we are saying. So how do we do this? We talked about numbers and masses of tourism, or tourists arriving in cities. One of the things that we can actually try and minimize is the number of tourists arriving in our cities. All right, although it's bringing a lot of money, the number of tourists, the more tourists you have things like traffic congestion, overcrowding, crime, because you are adding actually to the population of your own country. And some cities, if you remember correctly at the slides that we looked at, the number of tourists arriving in certain cities are actually more than the numbers of the population in the city. And it becomes a problem because the number of tourists arriving outweigh the population of the city. And so it is very important to look at the carrying capacity. What is carrying capacity? Carrying capacity is the physical capacity of a building or an environment to carry the finite number of people without eroding and having a wear and tear on that specific environment. So what we're saying is that the area that the tourists are arriving in, it should not be negatively impacted by the number of visitors. Hence we're saying we must be able to manage the number of people arriving in the city. That's carrying capacity. Being able to balance and manage carrying capacity. All right? How many people can the city manage or able to handle? Okay? So it varies from city to city based on the population and also the size of the area. All right? Obviously, cities like Cape Town and Joburg cannot be compared to cities like Windhoek because the size differs in square meters and the populations are also different. Cape Town and Joburg has a much more larger population than Windhoek. So obviously the carrying capacity will differ for each. Now, there is 4 types of carrying capacities that we can look at. The first one is the environment carrying capacity, what we call ecological carrying capacity. The second one is economic carrying capacity. The third one is what we call social carrying capacity. And the last one is the psychological carrying capacity. The ecological carrying capacity normally looks at how many people can an environment, a natural environment, handle. If you look at, for example, an area like Etosha National Park. Etosha National Park has a natural environment. It's untapped, a little bit untapped. But the more and more people come and visit Etosha National Park, there is a negative impact in that area, because as vehicles drive through, they leave their tracks. As people actually climb out of these vehicles and actually interact with the environment, they hinder what we call the natural space of that environment. And so even the reason why government has gone as far as basically only enabling NWR to be in the center of Etosha National Park. The only way to manage that is basically allowing these accommodation facilities to be in the nature park, because if they have to allow more hotels, or let's say lodges, that then can hinder the natural space of Etosha, because the more people are in that space, just imagine, these people have to share the space with the animals. These people, and obviously if you have to accommodate so many people, you are building more lodges and hotels. And what would happen to the trees, and what will happen to the natural space that the animals need to survive? And this will damage the environment. Secondly, economic carrying capacity is saying, even though the infrastructure is developing and the city is moving towards proper infrastructure, proper healthcare system, proper living standards for the local people, at the end of the day, this will cost a lot for the local people, because we know that as the living standards are going high and the quality of the services is increasing, we have to pay more for it as well. And so when we move to social carrying capacity, we actually also have a problem, because when these tourists come, they actually end up communicating with our local people. They actually mingle with the local people, and as they mingle with the local people, we have an exchange of different cultures. And so our local people and the people from Europe and America end up exchanging cultures, and from there certain values are lost. And so we move on to psychological carrying capacity. This also has to be managed very carefully by the government. Things like overcrowding and traffic congestion can have a very negative impact, not only on the environment, but on the local people. Things like pollution, air pollution, littering, all these things have a negative impact on the environment. But psychologically, as people and tourists come in and move into our area, the local people feel that due to the tourism activity, they have to pay so much costs for certain services. Services like accommodation, services like food, services like petrol. These services all go high as the living standards in the cities are upgraded due to this tourism activity. And so all these four carrying capacity or types of carrying capacities need to be managed so that we mitigate the negative impacts that tourism has on the environment, on the cultural lifestyle of our people, and so push up and maximize the positive impacts. So how did sustainable tourism develop? Well, before it was sustainable tourism, it was first ecotourism. Ecotourism developed in the 1960s. And the concern of governments was just basically to protect the natural environment. The concern was not really about the local culture and the carrying capacities. They were more concerned about the wildlife, and the plants that were becoming extinct. And so they focused more on protecting these animals that were endangered and were becoming extinct. And so they came up with what they call ecotourism. And so that focused only, the objective of ecotourism was basically to save the environment, the natural environment. And so as tourism grew and the focus of tourists moved from nature to adventure and leisure, all over the world decided to focus on a much bigger concept than just ecotourism. They moved into what we call sustainable tourism, a tourism that has minimal impact, minimal negative impacts, and more positive impacts on the environment, on the social lifestyle of people, on the cultural lifestyle of people, on the economy. So their focus was not only to protect the nature, but also to protect the lifestyles of the people, to protect the economy, because tourism can actually also have a downfall on certain economies, and it can also impact the cultural lifestyle of the local people. And so they thought that it's very, very, very impossible just to focus on one aspect of tourism by protecting that one aspect, which is the natural environment, while the other aspects that are also involved in tourism are being affected. So they actually combined everything and came up with what we call sustainable tourism. And sustainable tourism is actually the development of tourism that meets the present needs of the current generation without having an impact on the needs of the future generation. And these are social, ecological, and economic requirements. What we're saying is that from the 19th century, sustainable tourism or ecotourism focus just on natural tourism moved to a bigger picture in the 19th century, and they were focusing on much more bigger matters than just the natural ecological part of tourism areas. So they're focusing on the cultural aspect of everything, the local culture, how people are affected. Also, they're focusing on the social lifestyle of people, the economy, how it's affected by tourism. And so they painted a much bigger picture, and they focused on sustainable tourism. And sustainable tourism actually promoted today what we call responsible or soft tourism. Tourism which benefits both tourists and local community or government, having a minimal impact on negative, minimal impact on the nature, social, and economic impacts, and benefiting the local community better, and educating and training the local people how to benefit and to develop businesses. This today we call niche tourism. It's a new form. And three aspects that are basic, the principles that governments are focusing on when they are actually promoting sustainable tourism. The one aspect is green tourism, encouraging a lot of lodges to use solar energy, encouraging a lot of lodges and tourism businesses to recycle, use reusable resources, and also move away from mass tourism to promoting what we call responsible tourism by managing the carrying capacity, the number of tourists in a certain area, the number of infrastructure built in that area, also minimizing the impact of the tourist activities in the environment, allowing only a certain number of tourists in a certain area, also minimize the impact on the local community, minimizing or maximizing basically the economic benefits. Okay, so it is very important for the principles of sustainable tourism also focuses on educating and also training the local people and enforcing education and understanding about sustainable urban tourism in people, all right? To tell them that yes, we can make money, it's good for tourism to grow, but we need to minimize the negative impacts such as crime, drugs, overcrowding and congestion. We need to use tourism to benefit us, but also not to impact the needs of the future generation. That's what we. So the three important aspects that we need to look at is first green tourism, educating the local people about sustainable or green tourism, also rehabilitating and changing different infrastructure so that they support green tourism, moving away from normal electricity to solar power, reusing and making use of reusable material. All right, a lot of companies nowadays and shops are moving away from plastic because plastic is not easily, it's degradable. Okay, and also reduction of motor vehicle movements. So you find that a lot of people now in the cities are using public transport and bicycles to move around from place to place. So you avoid things like congestions in big cities that are visited by a lot of tourists. So tourists don't rent cars anymore because the more cars there is, you can't get to a certain area. So now cities are promoting safe cycling, safe public transport for people to move around. And so what we are saying is that let's develop tourism, but at the same time, we minimize the negative impact that tourism has. Let us manage the number of people and the activities of tourism in our cities. That was just the lesson for today, lesson 3. Please read through the lesson. There will be a quiz after this lesson. Thank you. Good night.